Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to our final panel of the conference before we have our closing keynote. I'm honored to introduce my colleague, Professor Meg Arenberg, who's going to chair this session, which is Panel 5, Intellectual Thought in Africa. Meg Arenberg is an assistant professor of comparative literature at the Africa Institute, where she also teaches in the African Languages and Translation program. She earned her PhD in comparative literature from Indiana University Bloomington and has held postdoctoral positions at Rutgers and Princeton. Her research focuses on 20th and 21st century African literatures with particular interest in Kiswahili poetics, intertextuality, and translation studied. In 2024, she was named one of the top 10 recipients of the PEN Heim Translation Fund grant. Professor Arenberg, thank you for accepting to do this task. Over to you.
Thank you, Grieve. You'll be able to tell from that introduction that I'm a bit out of my disciplinary depths in this room. But I'm honored and grateful to have the opportunity to chair this, in fact, interdisciplinary conversation about intellectual thought, drawing on the legacies of Thandika Mkandawire. Since you have full biographies in your programs, I'm not going to take time away from our discussion with lengthy introductions to our panelists, but I do want to name my esteemed co-presenters here, and then we'll follow the program as it's written in your written program. So first, we have a presentation by Binyam Sisay Mendisu, who is my fellow colleague at the Africa Institute, where he's Associate Dean and Professor of African Languages and Linguistics. We have Godwin Murunga, Executive Secretary of the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa in Dakar, Senegal. We have Maribel Mori, who is the Executive Director of the Miami Institute for the Social Sciences in Miami. And we have Steve Shara, independent researcher and educationist, former Dean and Associate Professor at the School of Education, Social Sciences and Technology, UNICAF University in Malawi. So, we'll start with Binyam, Dr. Mendisu, who will be presenting to us on the language and education conundrum in Africa, a persistent anomaly to development. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Meg. It's always a difficult task to be in the last panel, where you had a great feast of ideas, conversations in the morning, and then a great lunch, even including a dessert. So I don't know what we have to offer, but we'll do our best. So thank you very much, Grieve, for the invitation, and very happy to be here with esteemed colleagues from all over Africa and in the US as well. So this talk is about the language in education question in Africa and some of its implications to development. So a lot has been said, and nothing much has been done about it. So it continues to be a persistent problem. So I'm not sure if I bring any new ideas, but this is again a call, to me and to all of us, to bring attention to this issue and its close relation to development. So I will try to shed some light on why it is relevant, the language use in education question, and why nothing, almost nothing or little is being done about it. So we all know Africa is the most multilingual continent, and linguistic diversity is noted in both individual and societal levels. Thus, multilingualism is one of the most important characteristics of the continent and its people. And education is key to development, yet the education systems in Africa, as they have been structured and implemented over the recent decades, have failed to meaningfully improve the lives and aspirations of people in the continent. A significant yet often overlooked factor contributing to this failure is the language in education question. Despite long-standing recognition of the importance of introducing African languages into schools, little progress has been made in terms of meaningfully and substantially incorporating them into the educational infrastructure of education systems in the continent. Where efforts have been made, their effect largely remains at a superficial level. So my main focus today is on the early years of education, pre-primary and primary. However, I think the issues are, in one way or another, very relevant to education at a tertiary level or overall discussions about the intellectualization of African languages. And I'm also happy that my colleague Steve is also here. He will talk more about higher education and the intellectualization of African languages. I have never met Professor Thandika before, but first I heard his name from late Professor Andreas, who passed away a few months ago. In 2011, some of us, some of them are in this room, we have been organizing at Addis Ababa University this series of conversations on humanities. And Andreas spoke very highly of him, and he recommended that we invite him for those conversations. Unfortunately, it didn't work at the time, but that was a time when I started reading some of his work. And what I found is he is a kind of interdisciplinary intellectual that has something to offer to everyone, even to linguists like me. In connection to the importance of language, he wrote in 2005, "Language must hold a prominent place in African intellectual discourse, or Africa's experience with modernity and development." Thandika argued that promoting one's language should not be seen merely as an expression of cultural chauvinism or romanticism. African languages are not only vital for asserting cultural identity, but also serve as an essential tool for harnessing human resources and grounding scientific knowledge in African realities. And he wrote, I quote, "The language medium is crucial for harnessing human resources and grounding scientific knowledge in African realities." So he is one of those economists who were aware and who has done some work and thought about the importance of African languages. And another thing that I found appealing about his work is his call for historicizing the continent's developmental challenges and his challenge to look at things in a longer durée, which is the only way I think we can make sense of the challenges of development. And it's also, as we will see, very much related to the language in education conundrum that we are facing. Since this is a conference that we got together to reimagine and new directions, I think it's very important to take those interdisciplinary engagement. I also have a confession, because I'm criticizing policymakers, scholars like myself, but I take it as a self-reflection and as a self-critic, because even knowing what I know, I'm doing little in promoting African languages. So that may say something about my commitment, my personal commitment, but it also says a lot about the magnitude and complexity of the problem that we all are in using the languages, in one way or another, obliged to use some of the languages. Let me start with a story that a colleague of mine from Uganda wrote in 2020 in one of the online newspapers. The title was, "When A is Not for an Apple." She wrote, "In the village surrounding the university where I used to work in rural Uganda, I regularly meet neatly dressed boys and girls walking home from school, often stopped to talk with them in local dialect, asking them how school was, where they were going, or where I could buy some tomatoes. They always gave me well-articulated and thoughtful responses, revealing a definite personality as well as a strong awareness of themselves and their surroundings. However, when I met these same children at their primary school, where I was setting up a reading club, I noticed a stark contrast in their behavior. Gone were the confident kids of the village paths. At first, I wondered why, but now I know. Their loss of confidence is at the heart of problems with the education system in Uganda and much of Africa. At the reading club, which the children joined in their third year of primary school, the first thing we did was to gauge their reading proficiency. We did this in English, as by then they were supposed to be able to read and write in both English and their home language, but we found that the third-year learners couldn't barely read the first grade reading text, let alone those set for their own grades. So this puzzled her, and she started visiting the first grade schools. And what she found is a large alphabet chart was displayed prominently at the front of the class and looked like 100 others that I had seen in the past. It started off with the usual A is for apple, and it goes on, B is for this, and so this simple story speaks volumes about the state of education in the continent and the everyday challenges young children go through day to day. There are three issues I want to tease from this simple-looking story. Three challenges on the state of education in the continent. But before I present the challenges, I want to say a few words about it's not all doom and gloom in the continent. Over the last 3 decades, a lot has been achieved. And in terms of especially expanding education, a lot of work has been done. And in terms of making education accessible to girls, there has been a lot of success, but also in introducing some of the African languages, especially in countries like Ethiopia and South Africa. Great policies were put in place, and attempts were made also to implement them. Now, having said that, the major challenge is the quality of education. It has been deteriorating from time to time, and this can easily be seen by the state of reading skills in the continent. Most of children in the continent, having been in school for 3-4 years, they don't read and write. In some cases, it's even shocking that they can't read a single word. So not acquiring reading skills is a serious problem, because that's the base in which they build, they learn other skills. So if you miss it at those, period, from grade 1 to 2, then it will follow you up. And this quality of education problem is very much at the root of, the language question is at the root of this problem. And in some of the schools, even the teachers do not know English or the languages that they are supposed to teach in, which compounds the problem. So this problem with the quality of education is a serious one because it breeds inequality. And then there is a question of relevance. A is for apple. I see you notice something that the alphabet chart is very common even today in many of our classrooms. So imagine for a child the first letter they are introduced to, And the first association is an apple. How common is it in the continent, in rural areas? And even the language is different. So what does it mean to, to expose our students with an unfamiliar language and an unfamiliar concept? So this is also what Vijay has talked about yesterday, and I can assure you that little has changed in terms of the practice. Still, Blow, and London, and all of them are there. So little has changed. So this says a lot about the adaptation and contextualization. And the major problem is they were supposed to be empowered. They were supposed to be empowered, but what we are doing is we are disconnecting them, we are alienating them, we are confusing them, the kids. So education is supposed to take into account your experience, your culture, your knowledge, and build on it. Not disconnect you, not confuse you. So the first thing that they face is there is a disconnection between home and school. In fact, Falun Gong, the Senegalese linguist and thinker, once said, there is a rift. As soon as he moved to school, there is a rift has been created between him and his family and society. So the language question, once again, in alienating, in creating disconnection, is at the root of this problem. And this doesn't stop there. It affects self-belief, self-confidence, love of learning, and attitudes. In a way, this, in a lunch conversation yesterday, this is even in our times. This was a common practice. You are prevented from using your local language in school. This is a practice that is common, and it's still common in many places. Sometimes for a different reason, because in Ethiopia, for example, there was a case, private schools, doesn't allow kids to use Amharic because they want them to learn and focus in English. So what is happening? I think schools have become a site of violence. And there is some form of violence that is happening in schools. And can you imagine how vulnerable we are making them feel when kids at such a tender age are experiencing this confusion, disconnection, dislocation, and disconnection? So I didn't find the word to use it, but luckily, a few months ago, reading through an author, Suleiman Adonai. So this is, later on he turned to be a writer, but because of conflict, he have gone through first Eritrea and then Ethiopia, so he spoke Tigrinya when he was, a young child, and then moved to Amharic, and then he has to move to Sudan, so he switched to Arabic, and then to Saudi Arabia, and finally to the UK. So at a period of 7-8 years, as a young boy, he has to go through all dislocations. And one of the things that he said is he described it as a wound. That's what he said, the sort of departure that leaves wounds. The gains and the gains of new languages, but the losses. I think there is a lot of truth in it, and it gives us a glimpse of what is happening in the minds and hearts of young children. So this is important because it also gives us the urgency of the question, the language in education question in Africa and its relation to development. Let me point 2 points which I think are very relevant to the question of why this is happening. One of the claims it has been made many times is our attitude and perception of multilingualism. So our attitude of multilingualism is often misunderstood, disregarded, and it has historically been understood as a political problem in an effort of African modern states to create national culture. There are those who reduce it, like, these categories of Francophone, Anglophone, Lusophone, this and that, or in some cases even African languages, like prioritizing Amharic or Yoruba or Hausa and this and that, or Kiswahili. These are all involved in some kind of violence, which also doesn't give us the much needed nuance to make policy and strategy. And then there are others which also, historically as well, which proliferates they create unnecessary divisions between languages and dialects, resulting in a complicated linguistic landscape that lacks coherence. So the Ghanaian linguist Prah have talked about this, and in fact, through study, he reduced them. He always denied Africa as a Tower of Babel, and he said, it has become a barrier to unity and development. So I want to invite us here to think about multilingualism not as a curse and not as a problem, but in line with one of our colleagues, Hussein Ali Do, based on the work of Nana Asmau, who said, what would we do differently if we think multilingualism as a lingua franca? So there is this obsession that lingua franca has to be one language. But it could be a practice, and it is a practice. This is a way of life, a knowledge system, and it's been practiced already. So I invite us to think about multilingualism as a lingua franca. In fact, Professor Zeleza also in his 2017 article talked about multilingualism as a reality in much of Africa, and not simply in terms of proficiency that many people have in Africa in European language, but in terms of proficiency they have in several African languages in which mixed language forms and code switching among these languages characterize communicative practice. I think he's also alluding to the same issue. And then the second reason, I think, which is the last one, is about our perception on the role of language. In education, it's important tool for communication, so even it's not serving us for communication. Students have to learn what the teacher is saying. They are not learning that. And then also looking at it as a repository, archive of knowledge, memory, and culture is important, and it can make a lot of difference in the way we do things. And I want to allude to Majid, who also extended it yesterday in the discussions, saying that sometimes even language thinks for us. I think that is powerful, and I want to engage more with those conversations. And I hope this will help for some of the questions that we may want to discuss. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. For our next speaker, I want to invite to the floor Dr. Godwin Murunga to speak on grounded methodologies, the power behind Thandika Mkandawire's work.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I want to join colleagues who have made the presentations in thanking the Institute for extending this invitation to us. And I know that I occupy a rather rare position, since I have the privilege of sitting in the same seat that the late Professor Thandika sat. And anybody who met Thandika would have enjoyed the sense of humor that he carried. Issa Shivji actually does say that he had this very rare capacity of telling sense through humor. And that humor was most of the time very playful on the surface. But in fact, it had very profound messages. And since this is the final panel of the day, I just wish that I was allowed to talk about the humor that Thandika did. He was a very good friend of Aikwe Yama. Those of you who know Aikwe Yama, he lives in Popenguine, several, maybe 100 or so kilometers from Dakar. And many of the books that Codesria published that were translated into French or back into English were actually translated by Professor Aikwe Yama. So I wish we could just talk about the humor this afternoon so that nobody slips off into sleep. The question I would like to briefly explore is the question of what made Thandika Mkandawire's work so powerful and so convincing and so impactful to the work that we do. And I feel that there are three kinds of literature that contain an answer to this particular question, all written by him. The first one of which would be that he had a very sound understanding of the African higher education scene and understood the sector very well across regions, across countries. And he understood the social science community in a way that I'm not too sure I have seen anyone else reproduce. In his idle moment, he wrote an essay titled 3 Generations of African Intellectuals. I'm not sure too many people have read that essay, but it's an essay that characterizes the 3 generations of African intellectuals that he knew up to 1995. Our friend Mshai Mwangola, who sits on the executive committee of Codesria, has written an essay that complements Thandika's work. But perhaps for me, the more powerful essay was African Intellectuals and Nationalism, which is published in a book which he edited as part of the collection of essays from the 30th anniversary of Codesria. But a third essay that spoke to me as I prepared for this was an occasional paper he published in Denmark titled A Note on the Consultancy Culture in Africa. If you read those 3 things, you are in a position to understand the nature, the changing character, and the way the African intellectual community behaves and does its thing. The second thing that I think is important for me to put on the table is that he had this very rare capacity to understand and ground his criticisms of anything he undertook to do on the basis of that understanding of the social science community. So you wanted a fine economist who understood the trends in economics. You read Thandika's The Spread of Economic Doctrines and Policy Making in Post-Colonial Africa, which is an essay published in the African Studies Review in 2014. Or you read his work on the developmental state, which is published in the Cambridge Journal. Or if you wanted to try in the area of conflict studies, you read The Terrible Toll of Post-Colonial Rebel Movements in Africa. Those were works that were produced after rigorous engagement with empirical data, perhaps in a way that was rare by our standards. And The Terrible Toll especially was a work that demonstrated the extent to which sound methodological grounding was the basis of the work that Thandika did. When he decided to write an essay that he meant to have impact in society, he never released it within a few years. He released it after several years. The Spread of Economic Doctrines, I think I saw it maybe more than 4 years in draft before it was eventually published. And he also had a very, very good way of understanding what our colleagues Ndongo Sila mentioned yesterday. He had a way of busting pathological constructs about Africa. Not many people, I suspect, have read Thandika Mkandawire's essay on the intellectual itinerary of Jeffrey Sachs, which was a review of a book that placed Jeffrey Sachs in the context of the developments that were happening. And in a sense, essentially said that Jeffrey Sachs' eclectic intellectualism allowed him to do virtually everything, including things that were totally contradictory. And at many points when I go on YouTube and I'm looking at some of the latest star intellectuals, I remember Thandika Mkandawire's article on the intellectual itinerary of Jeffrey Sachs. But perhaps for me, most importantly, I think was his essay in World Politics. The essay that took on the notion of neo-patrimonialism and asked the question, how come everything about Africa's governance is blamed on this thing called neo-patrimonialism? And he was able, therefore, to demonstrate that there was a problem not in Africa, but with the notions that were being used to construct an understanding of the continent. So what I want to do in the remaining minutes, I can see the clock is running away from me, is to make the point that for Thandika to do many of the things he did, he had this sound and sophisticated interdisciplinary understanding of the issues he was dealing with. And at the basis of that was a fine methodological savviness that perhaps if I were to teaching in the Africa Institute next year, if they invite me, I would say, let's take Thandika, but let's not listen to what he's saying. Let us listen to how he is saying it and how he is detecting the contradictions, how he is identifying concepts and busting them. Because I think at the heart of Thandika's work was a savviness around methodology that we have hardly appreciated, including, as I said at the start of this presentation, his humor. Because I haven't seen anybody who has said very interesting things about partnerships, like Thandika did by just splitting the word networking into two, netting and working, with the natives doing the netting in Africa and the real people doing the working in the north. And you don't need any sophisticated analysis of the concept to know that he was making a fine commentary on partnerships across the north and the south. What I want to do is to use the essay on neo-patrimonialism to make 2 to 3 points which I think that are very important. Number one, that at the heart of some concepts that are used to study Africa are embedded some real contradictions that make it difficult to see what they are saying. With respect to the notion of neo-patrimonialism, Thandika did argue that the construction of the notion of patrimonialism, and especially the neo-patrimonial logic, was an assumption that it was an all-encompassing and ubiquitous concept, a concept that, in fact, contained irrefutable logic. So how do you refute the logic of a concept that has irrefutable logic? And for a very long time, there were too many books that were published based on the notion of neo-patrimonialism, and it took Thandika to remind us that the idea of paradigms, the idea of epistemic communities, is based on the assumption that they are debating communities. They are not communities of consensus, and that at the heart of busting concepts, you need to have engagements around concepts like this one in order to bust their irrefutable logic. In his analysis, he made the argument that the logic within the neo-patrimonial concept only includes and admits evidence that conforms to that very logic. If the evidence does not conform to the logic within the neo-patrimonial logic, he argued that he essentially made the argument that if the logic does not conform, then you refer to the first point, which is that it has irrefutable logic in the first place. And so he went on to demonstrate in his analysis that part of the challenge of dealing with the neo-patrimonial logic is that it had constituted an epistemic community that in itself was conforming. It was a conforming community designed to project epistemic communities not as debating communities, but as communities that had an internal self-reinforcing logic and that they were self-contained. And in the work that Thandika did with Codesria, he made sure that he sent different African academics into these communities in order to bust those communities and the logic that they used. And the fine example one can use is an essay which I'm not sure too many people have read, A Glimpse in African Studies, made in the USA, which was written by Mahmoud Mamdani following a conference that was held at Emory University at the Carter Center. And it became a long debate in the pages of Codesria, which led to another debate between the late Claude Ake and Nyang Nyong'o, Peter Nyang Nyong'o. But the interesting dimension to this, which speaks to the nature of the publishing industry, was that that debate was then picked up and published somewhere in the US, and all major subsequent references to that debate continued as though this debate did not originate in the pages of Codesria Bulletin. And so perhaps in terms of our methodological interest, we need to redirect our students back to the original places where some of these debates have been started. And I just want to make the additional point that with respect to Thandika's methodological questioning of the notions of neo-patrimonialism and the internal logic that it developed, he developed a very good sense of what the evidence says in order to begin to question the weak and shaky grounding upon which the notion was built. And more often than not, Thandika made the argument that in developing a neo-patrimonial argument, many of the analysts who used this tended to refer more to anecdotal evidence than they did to reasoned, well-developed databases. And the point that Thandika was making around this was that when you are using anecdotal evidence, one anecdote is a comment on something tiny, two, something tiny. But if you can develop a pattern out of it, then you can begin to see how anecdotes are useful as methodological tools on commenting on several of the very specific issues that communities and people in everyday life deal with. But for Thandika, he was worried that each time he read the neo-patrimonial analysis, he found that where the evidence seems to challenge the assumptions of the school, there was a reversion to caveats. So you make an argument, but you introduce a caveat to shield yourself from active criticism. Hedging, you hedge the argument so that it's not susceptible to criticism. And then he says qualifying asides. So that tendency to do that did not open up the analysis to sufficient questioning. And he makes the point that the contradictory forms of evidence and conclusions one finds in this often within the school was treated as if they are not contradictions. While contradictions are the flavor of serious inquiry, within the patrimonial logic, they were only resolved by reference to the original logic that neo-patrimonialism, in fact, was the problem for Africa's development. And in terms of the question of agency, he made the argument that you look at the analysis and what strikes you more is that the agency of the elite that is active within the logic of that argument. Beyond that logic, those, the non-elite, if you will, did not have agency and therefore did not qualify in sufficient ways to be given an active voice within that way of reasoning. And the point I want to make here is that we are all socialized at the methodological level to make several assumptions about methodology, one of which is that we think of methodology as a system of thinking that frames how research questions are derived, instruments are designed, data is collected. When we talk about data analysis, we don't realize that there is a subjective and there is an objective element if you want to do that, and that at the end of the day, data is subjected to disciplining. You discipline your data in order to tell the story that you want to tell. And for Thandika, this worried him quite a bit because there were instances where a priori assumptions about the data are put into the logic of the argument, and that when you want to ask questions around this, that those set of a priori assumptions are not given the kind of weight that one would want to do. And he therefore gets to the point where he makes the argument that at least with respect to the neo-patrimonial argument, it reflects what he said is the bad side of any methodological debate, and essentially concluded that one, it is based on ideal types. It's an assumption derived from an ideal type. And he said, if you think about Max Weber and the arguments he was trying to make around questions of bureaucracy, ideal types are just meant to be that. They're supposed to be ideal. They are not necessarily always a comment on the reality in the sense in which we are understanding if we subject it to proper methodological analysis. So in conclusion, Thandika did make a powerful argument that, and I would just like to read the conclusion of that essay because I think it's a powerful comment on that. He said that in conclusion, the call, therefore, is for more concrete studies of the African continent and an approach that enjoys a healthier relationship with the empirical world that most of us live in. I would recommend this essay as perhaps one of the most interesting ways in which to read the methodological power that Thandika brought to his analysis. And I could do the same for a whole number of different articles that Thandika did, including the book, Our Continent, Our Future. Let me conclude with the story that Thandika told me at some point when we met in Stockholm. He gave his his inaugural lecture at the LSE, which is a very, very powerful lecture that I would recommend all of us read. And two young editors of a journal called African Affairs, which is based somewhere in London, approached him and said, we would like to publish this particular essay. Reluctantly, he agreed, because they were young professors somewhere in the UK who seemed to have their politics on the right side. They actually sent the essay out to 2 peer reviewers. One of the peer reviewers had one major comment which he elaborated over several pages, according to Thandika. And his problem was that, I'm assuming it was he because I don't know the identity of that person. His major problem was one, that Thandika had criticized someone whom he, as a peer reviewer, thought was loyal to Africa. And the argument was that it's totally unfair to be critical of this man who has spent so many years loyal to Africa. The second reviewer had an even more interesting comment. He said, the author does not understand World Bank literature. Thank you very much.
I'm deep in my notes here, okay. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Maribel Mori to give the presentation on 2 world-renowned development economists in Sweden, an analysis of Thandika Mkandawire's views on Gunnar Myrdal's work.
Thank you, Meg. Thanks so much. And I think with that, a good one, you mentioned Stockholm, so it's a good segue to talk about Sweden. So I want to thank first the Africa Institute for this wonderful invitation. It's been a dream to be here the last few days. And Grieve, thank you specifically too for the invitation. You suggested I would meet so many fascinating scholars, committed human beings, and institution builders, and you has not let me down. It has been amazing. And of course, your wonderful wife, Moanza. Shout outs. So I also saw this as an opportunity to throw myself in the work of Thandika Mkandawire. And why? Why am I invested in this work? So I should give a little background in my personal biography. I was born in Miami, and both of my parents came from Cuba. And I grew up very much with the reality of human disappointment on either side of the Iron Curtain. So ever since I was a little girl, I have dreamed about an alternative or different versions of political economies where everyone can thrive in their day-to-day life. So that has shaped very much my raison d'être as an adult. So I look at people from the past to learn where we could possibly go into the future. And here I'm going to be talking about the history of economic thought. And theory and practice are intertwined. So as much as we might want to separate it, we all carry theories of change, theories of social change. And here we're going to be comparing Thandika's and Gunnar's theories of social change and where they split and overlap, because that shapes not only what we think is, but what can be. So I start the narrative in the beginning of Thandika's journey to Sweden. So in 1965, Thandika Mkandawire found himself in Ecuador with no way to return to the United States, where he had been studying at Ohio State University. The government in Malawi had revoked his passport, and he subsequently traveled to various foreign embassies in Ecuador to see if there's a way to go to Europe and then back to the US. Ultimately, as Thandika recalled, quote, "I went around embassies seeking asylum. Swedish officials advised me to seek admission to a Swedish university, secure some funding, and since I still had my passport, I should be able to travel to Sweden." This marked the beginning of Thandika's experience as an exile in Sweden. At a personal level, it was a painful experience, as he remembered years later, to realize that you cannot go home. For the next 10 years, from the late 1960s to the late 1970s, Thandika remained in Sweden, subsequently receiving a grant to travel to an African institution of his choice. The trip to Dakar would launch Thandika's next chapter at Codesria, where he served in leadership positions from 1980 to 1996. But before then, during the late 1960s and 70s, Thandika continued his graduate studies in economics at the University of Stockholm. In an interview with scholar Kate Meagher at LSE, he reminisced, "Sweden was very hospitable for political refugees. There were so many of us from different parts of the world in Stockholm. Intellectually, you met a lot of people worrying about the same problems you were thinking about democracy, human rights, exile, etc. It was intellectually stimulating," end quote. Among those intellectual influences in Thandika's life at the time was Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal. By then, Gunnar was a leading economist on the world stage. As economist Ravi Kanbor writes, he wrote in the Swedish tradition, turned and questioned basic theories of economics, a founder of the Swedish school, and with theories that would come out in Keynes's general theory, and one of the founders of the Swedish welfare state. In fact, along with his wife, Alma Reimer Myrdal, they were two main architects of the Swedish welfare state in the 1930s. After launching and accomplishing quite a bit of that in the 30s, Gunnar went on to direct the study of race in the US, resulting in the publication of An American Dilemma, which helped launch a national conversation on racial equality in the US. He then served the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, while Alva served as Swedish ambassador to India. He then went and started directing a study of economic trends and policies in South Asian countries. In '61, he returned to Sweden, and during that time, he published Asian Drama, an inquiry into the poverty of nations and the challenge of world poverty, described as his magnum opus, a book that took the development world by storm in the 1960s and 70s. At the time of the publication of Asian Drama, Thandika was living in Stockholm. And to the best of my knowledge, Thandika was still in Stockholm when Gunnar won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1974. Gunnar was then 76 years old and Thandika 34. So here we have two economists, a younger one and an older one, living in Stockholm, both associated with the University of Stockholm. It's a university and a city that I have come to know after spending 2 decades researching Gunnar Myrdal's own work on nationalism, equality, and race. I wrote a book about it called White Philanthropy, rooting Gunnar Myrdal's analysis of race in the US, An American Dilemma, with his US funders' prior grant-making work in 1920s and 1930s British Africa, Carnegie Corporation of New York. I have also rooted his work in the US to Sweden and how other scholars push back against his vision for nationhood in the US. Scholars such as W.B. Du Bois, Oliver C. Cox, Charles V. Hamilton, C.L.R. James, and Stokely Carmichael, among others, who saw limitations in Myrdal's program for achieving Black Americans' equality in the US, particularly Myrdal's ultimate goal of helping white Anglo-Americans re-justify their dominance as an imperial power. As Myrdal wrote in An American Dilemma, quote, "The coming difficult decades will be America's turn in the endless sequence of main actors on the world stage. For perhaps several decades, the whites will still hold the lead, and America will be the most powerful white nation," end quote. For such a quote-unquote white nation to maintain global domination, Myrdal calculated in An American Dilemma that the US would need to prove its moral superiority, and ideally by treating Black Americans as white Americans would treat each other, and in the process by assimilating Black Americans into white Anglo-American whiteness, making Blackness disappear. In this 1944 publication, Myrdal called upon white Americans to demonstrate their moral sensibilities to a national and global audience, with a definition of racial equality leaving intact white Anglo-American domination within and beyond the country. So there, I started thinking, I wonder, these two economists living in Sweden, how Thandika would have responded to Gunnar Myrdal's own ideas of national level work and then international development, also thinking about Gunnar's own assumptions about race in these two different projects. So I started scouring Thandika Mkandawire's work and looking for any mention of Myrdal, and analyzed how the two men differed in their varying perspectives or theories of change at the national and international levels. So we can start by acknowledging that Thandika did mention that Gunnar was an influence in his life, as he told Kate Meagher, his colleague. The economics department in the University of Stockholm was going through some very dramatic changes away from the Gunnar Myrdal type economics, heterodox development economics, to which I was attracted, to a much more neoclassical economics. For decades to come, Gunnar's work would continue to serve as a useful interlocutor for Thandika. As we can see through Thandika's citations of Myrdal, he agreed with various aspects of Gunnar's thinking. For starter, Thandika Mkandawire appreciated Gunnar's calls for economists to be more blatant about the social conditions shaping their research. This is because too often, and many times inaccurately, as both economists noted, the public and its governments have assumed that the social science research upon which they relied on was quote-unquote objective. Here we have an example. In 2014, Thandika published an article titled "The Spread of Economic Doctrines and Policymaking in Post-Colonial Africa." As he noted in the acknowledgments, earlier versions of this article were presented as a keynote address at the November 2011 meeting of the African Studies Association in Washington, D.C., and as a keynote speech at the Ethiopian Economic Association Conference in 2003. In these earlier versions of the paper, particularly the one at the 2003 Ethiopian Economic Association Conference, Thandika had started his paper with a 90-word quotation from Gunnar Myrdal's Asian Drama. So much as Gunnar in Asian Drama, Thandika in this article, "The Spread of Economic Doctrines and Policymaking in Post-Colonial Africa," urged readers to question the marketplace of ideas shaping their own assumptions about what was and was not possible in development. While Gunnar in '68 honed in on the role of shifting fads among Western governments and how they shaped Western economists' focus towards developing countries after the Second World War, Thandika in 2014 placed emphasis on donors and how they shaped research, the caprices of the invisible hand, and how they have both affected the supply and demand side of economists. A second one that we see, a second influence or space of citation, is promoting the need for a strong democratic state in development. So in thinking about developmental states in Africa, 2001, Thandika discussed how existing literature on development assumed it to be critical for a developmental state to enjoy autonomy and for it to be a strong state. So to quote the piece, "It is usually assumed that such a state should be a strong state, in contrast to what Gunnar Myrdal referred to the soft state, that neither had the administrative capacity nor the political wherewithal to push through its developmental projects." For the sake of timing, I'm going to skip over. And if you want to know more about his definition of the strong state and how he was pushing back against Gunnar Myrdal's own, I can talk about that in the Q&A. A second point was promoting the need for nation building in development. So much as Gunnar Myrdal emphasized nationhood as a critical prerequisite for a strong democratic developmental state, so did Thandika. To give some context, Gunnar Myrdal helped shape nationhood or nationalism in Sweden in the 1930s, along with his wife Alva Reimer Myrdal, a researcher in her own right. And what they tried to do was to bridge Swedes, particularly white Swedes, across class lines, so that they saw a similarity where they before had seen biological difference across classes. And in the process, create unity that you needed, that they assumed you needed, in order to propel the state to promote several social policies that would help all of them equalize their social environments, socio-political, economic environments. And I can cite that one later, but we see it I'll give you that later if you need it. So both of them, Thandika like Gunnar, assumed that nationalism, the creation of nationalism, was important as a prerequisite for a strong state. They debated what they meant by a strong state, but they did talk about a strong state as an ultimate means to developing policies that were multi-layered. And what are these multi-layered policies? It's almost akin to the welfare state in Sweden for Gunnar Myrdal. So in 1974, Myrdal addressed directly the question, what is development? And to the question, he responded, by development, I mean the movement upward of the entire social system. For Gunnar, like Thandika, would add the elimination of poverty among the goals of development. And I can go more into it, but Thandika stressed in Running While Others Walk in 2011 that many of the ends of development, better education, better health, and greater freedom, are also powerful transformative instruments for development. However, there's a big distinction. For example, while they both agreed on this theory of social change, Thandika had much more faith than this older Swede that citizens in developing countries could nurture a significantly strong shared national identity to inspire and support a democratic state to successfully pass the multi-layered social policies that they both perceived necessary for development. And we see this play out through Thandika's criticism of Gunnar's Asian drama, which he basically calls pessimistic. And why? For starters, Gunnar compromised on his insistence that developmental states in the region would necessarily need to be democratic. He wrote, "It may be doubted whether this ideal of political democracy with political power based on free elections and with the freedom of assembly, press, and other civil liberties should be given weight in formulating the modernization ideals. This is because, quote, experience has shown that, unlike the other value premises, this ideal is not essential to a system compromising all the other modernization ideals." But where did this come from? Why this distinction? To understand why Thandika and Gunnar differed on the relative ability of developing countries, and these are terms they use, I'm using their terms, outside of quote-unquote the Western world, which Gunnar Myrdal defined to be outside of Europe and North America, and some what he considered white British areas of the world, to develop through strong democratic states, one must acknowledge that Gunnar's faith in the public and its intellectuals decreased as he traveled from developed to developing countries. So for example, Asian drama, a critic, Susanta Gunatilake, wrote in a critique of Asian drama, "The masses to whom he, Gunnar Myrdal, has so little access emerge as having several negative characteristics. They are ignorant of the need for development, they are inarticulate, very poor, split by caste and community, and in discussion on the possibilities of an upper-class dictatorship for South Asia, Myrdal brings an underlying tone of regret that the South Asian masses cannot always be deprived of the vote and brought under heel." And also, Gunatilake notes that Gunnar Myrdal does not cite scholars from the region. According to a research associate of Gunnar Myrdal's, Gunnar, quote, and there's a quote, "saw the half-naked brown bodies in an Indian textile factory who seemed utterly alien to him, and he could not find anything in common with them." We can see this perspective in Gunnar Myrdal's own writings, including his 1957 lecture on economic nationalism in underdeveloped countries, where he described the population outside of the Western world, the populations, as, quote, poor, illiterate, and backward in all respects. This negative and dismissive view of the people outside of the, quote, Western world helps explain why Gunnar had little faith that democratic developmental states would necessarily thrive outside of the West. By contrast, Thandika Mkandawire held steadfast to this hope, not least because he saw the full humanity in the populations and the full intellectual contributions of the intelligentsia in developing regions of the world, including Africa. Thandika Mkandawire had many chapters in his life. Today, I have asked us to sit and reflect on the time of his life where he was influenced or was in dialogue with and pushed back against a major economist in Stockholm. He had some aspects of Gunnar Myrdal's work that he admired. He admired Gunnar Myrdal's emphasis on criticizing and having a critical lens on the field of economics. He admired Gunnar Myrdal's emphasis that there should be nationalism as a means towards a strong developmental state that was democratic, though he did underline that strong state should be questioned. And he also found resonance in Gunnar Myrdal's emphasis on comprehensive social policies. And I can add another part in the Q&A about how both of them viewed it as cumulative causation, that one social policy would affect another, like a domino effect. So you wanted to find the right sequence of social policies that would build upon each other in a positive direction rather than a negative one. And so looking to the future, Thandika envisioned a world where the African publics and their intellectuals would come together to further strengthen their country's national identities, and subsequently together would shape plans for development and empower their democratic developmental states to realize their collective visions. What the Swedish public and its intellectual leaders had achieved for themselves in Sweden, in nation building and relatedly in empowering a strong democratic developmental state to pass comprehensive social policies as means for development, Thandika remained confident that the African publics and their intellectual leaders could define for themselves and achieve for themselves in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And for our final presenter, last but not least, Dr. Steve Sharjah will speak to us about tracing Mkandawire's thought on African intellectuals and higher education in a 21st century developmental state. Welcome.
So I cannot guarantee, I'm not very confident that the abstract that I submitted survived contact with the paper. But the title did, so it's still within that same framework. So it's been an amazing 3 days, very wonderful. I'm a teacher, began as a primary school teacher, and then became a teacher, educator, and my work cuts across curriculum, teacher education, and educational policy. And that's how I read Thandika. It's also how I am absorbing everything that I'm hearing here. As I think Kim said yesterday, she said she went to a school where they didn't assign Thandika. Same with me. I had to read him on my own. Same with other Malawian luminaries like Prof. Tiambe Zeres. I had to read them on my own and teach myself what they are telling us. So I am going to do 2 things mostly. One, go over what I'm calling 3 archetypes of Thandika, or Mary says chapters. And then the other thing is I'm going to point in the direction that we probably should consider going based on what Paul Zeleza said 2 days ago on building on the foundation that Thandika laid. So my point of departure is the essay I wrote in the Kodesuri Bulletin. That was a special issue on Thandika soon after his transition, where I talked about how I got to know about Thandika before I had even met him. I had heard about him at a very young age, and then met him for the first time in 2012. But I had been in touch with him via email from around 1997 or thereabouts. So I mostly spent that essay describing my relationship with him, but also talking about how reading him opened my perspectives as to his contributions to global knowledge and development theory. So the 3 Thandikas I'm presenting on is the Malawian Thandika, which is the first one. It's mostly what Thandika wrote about, what he spoke about, including on Malawian discussion listservs. And then the global Thandika, who gave us democratic developmental states, inclusive social theory, transformative social theory, and other concepts. And then the future Thandika, like where do we go from here? What do we do with Thandika's work? What do we do with this conference here? Where do we go next? So I start with an essay that he wrote in the Southern African Political and Economic Monthly, the magazine that used to be published by SAPES Trust in Harare. When I was in secondary school, and I used to buy magazines and books, and I remember buying this. One day I found it by accident. It had survived 3 decades since I left secondary school, but I had it, and it was in one of my archives. So I read this essay, very powerful essay, very well written. He had just landed in Malawi for the first time in 32 years. It was 5th January. It was 11 a.m. Malawi time, because he even recorded the time. And I went through what home is not and what home is. So it's not necessarily the place where one was born, nor is it the place where one spent one's early childhood, not where one's parents came from, not where one spent one's most life. None of these fitted his life. So for him, home was where one had staked earlier territorial claims on this earth. And for him, that was Malawi. Because he has a line in that, as Godwin was saying, he was very, very funny, this great sense of humor. So he wrote in that essay, so he was a Swede returning home to Malawi. So he went up north, northern Malawi, where his father came from, and met his parents, and they were all in tears. We stayed up all night. Okay, so the slides are moving. Yeah, stayed up all night, and the kids danced all night. And reading this made me recall what also Obama wrote in his first book, Dreams from My Father. If you read that book, it's 450 pages long. And it's Obama's life from when he was born, years spent in the US, in Hawaii, Indonesia, Harvard. And then he spends 3 months in Kenya for the first time. So, 450 pages in that book, Kenya, those 3 months take up 150 pages in the book. He had arrived home. He said who he was, and people knew who he was. And so a very touching moment in both pieces. 9 years later, Thandika came to Malawi and gave a keynote at a conference that was commemorating 10 years of since Malawi's referendum, which transitioned Malawi from one-party rule to multi-party rule. So he gave the keynote, and he said it was the first time that he was giving a talk on Malawian soil. So he talked, it was a long essay, long speech, talked about a lot of things, most of the theories, but it's where, at least from my perspective, we see him talking about what became his philosophy of development. Because he said these were 3 challenges for Malawi. A developmental, social, political, economic order that mobilizes and manages its material, financial, and human resources to achieve high rates of growth and structural change. And it should ensure that it respects the human rights of all citizens, and it should be therefore socially inclusive. So he had this penchant for detail. He was very active on Malawian listservs. That's where I first met him. So when I got to the University of Iowa, one of the first things I did was, and this is 1997, when internet was just beginning, but there was already a Malawian discussion listserv, an email one. So I joined it and immediately came in contact with Thandika, saw what he was posting, and got in touch with him and all of that. But so he commented on everything, including sports, including music and arts and literature and everything. But it's also where we, for somebody like me who is not an economist, but started seeing his thoughts on the Bretton Woods institutions, for example. He was commenting about what was happening and this shift. So the Mia Karpas that later on, last time I met Thandika was in Dakar at the General Assembly, Codeso General Assembly, and we got into King Fahd Hotel, and right away we sat down and opened his laptop and showed me this manuscript that he was working on. And he was telling me he was cataloging each Mia Karpa from the World Bank and the IMF. So we saw a lot of that on the list serves. But one memorable thing that he posted, and it became, it went viral, even before the term going viral came about. There was a discussion one day, and this was in August 2010, on the forum. Somebody said Thandika should run for president in Malawi. And so he responded, and this is what he said. I think we are making the mistake of assuming a good academic record makes for a good politician. There is something about politics. I have known intellectually respectable academics become political disasters and unfathomable idiots. My life mission is academic and trying to speak truth to power. This is quoted by so many people in Malawi. It's a meme in Malawi. And Malawi has had its fair share of presidents who used to be professors, academics, and then became president and became idiots, really. So the global Thandika now, he's the one who gave us these theories. And I think pretty much every presentation here has mentioned these theories. But for me, just going through this literature and learning about the Lagos Plan of Action and the Berg report and the SAPs and all of that is just eye-opening. And regional cooperation and integration, reindustrialization. But I think out of this, the point I sort of take away from Thandika is his thought on how states treat their people and how that shapes the character of the nation, of the people. So in 2018, landed, and then I think the conference was beginning on Monday. So that Sunday before the conference started, the assembly, we had lunch. It was very long lunch. Started around noon, ended around 5 or 6 with Thandika and with another Malawian in Dakar. So we were going to pick up our food. And I noticed that everyone left their phone or tablet on the table. And I was very surprised. So I asked David, the other Malawian, and said, we are all leaving our phones on the table. He said, it's very safe. Nobody will steal. Nobody here in Senegal will steal a phone. That's what he said. So how do you build a nation like that? And he said, let's ask Thandika. So we sat down, began eating, and we asked Thandika. And Thandika said, when a state treats its people with dignity, with respect, it shapes the character of that people. I think this is a very powerful idea, and I would really love, for me, because of my teaching, curriculum, educational policy, whenever I hear anything that's striking, I want it in the curriculum. I want teachers teaching it. And so some of the things that I think we need to think about moving on from here, what goes into the curriculum, what goes into educational policy, public policy, and so on. So now coming to the role of African intellectuals and also higher education. Also, I think a lot has been said already. Many presentations have touched on that. So I shouldn't really belabor the point here. But I think this is where we now really need to start thinking of the next agenda. So the new directions that are in the title of this conference. So this language of speaking truth to power and also constructing a democratic, developmental, social, and inclusive social order. It's very interesting that as I was preparing for this paper, I asked quite a few people a number of questions. One of my questions was to the National Planning Commission in Malawi. And I asked them, to what extent did Thandika's work help shape what became the Malawi 2063 vision? It's a vision that was launched in 2020 and it runs through 2063 because Malawi got its self-rule in 1963 and then 64 independence. But 63 is taken as the nominal, or at least I think it's the year that the OAU was formed. And so in 2063, it will be 100 years since the OAU was formed. So the response I got was that some, not everything, but I was told that some of Thandika's articles were shared with the team that developed that policy. In 2007, CODES reorganized a conference in Malawi, the Guy Muhone Memorial Conference. Thandika worked with Guy Muhone. In fact, they were related. He even says that in one of his articles. And so it was at this conference where Thandika, I think, tried to get Malawian academics to begin talking about this democratic, developmental state and inclusive social policy. So 4 presentations from that conference went into a book that was edited by Richard Tamblas. We lost him in 2020, unfortunately. But that book talks about reforming the Malawi public sector and the developmental state and so on. So yesterday, Marion talked about the fertilizer input subsidy program in Malawi, FISP, and she cited Chinsinga. Chinsinga thought that in this book, thought that Malawi had room to talk about the developmental state, especially because of what happened in 2005-2006, when the donors, as we heard Grieve this morning saying at the World Bank, the IMF, they hate subsidies. And they all said, we are not supporting this subsidy. But the opposition in Malawi said, we are not passing this budget unless there is a universal subsidy. So the government was forced to put it into the budget. It passed, and Malawi had its biggest food surplus since it was born as a nation. So Chinsinga thinks that is what you can achieve in a developmental state, and Malawi needs to continue with that. So I think that we have that room in Malawi with the vision 2063, and I would like to really argue to CODES to Grieve, with this workshop going forward. Let's get the Agenda 2063. I don't know what has happened to it. I'm not hearing much about it anymore. But when I read it, I was blown away. It's very powerful. It's got its own weaknesses, but I think it's a blueprint that we can work with, and I think it can work well together with these concepts that we're talking about going forward. So, of course, Chinsinga has been critical of the Agenda 63 because he sees it as really top-down. It starts from the top. There is not much that's from the bottom going up. So maybe let me just finish with a new book that came out last month, the Oxford Handbook on the Malawi Economy. It's a huge book, 704 pages, Oxford University Press, $130 on some websites, which is 300,000 Malawi kwacha, salary for a civil servant, $212 in other places. But Thandika, this book is a tribute to Thandika and all of that. So I think I want to end by saying, in thinking about new directions, with Grieve, we've been discussing a Thandika Mkandawire Research Institute in Malawi. And so I think between the last activity here, the keynote and dinner, we are going to just sit somewhere here for a few minutes and discuss what we can do with this idea. And so if you're interested, join us so that we can begin the conversation. Thank you very much.
Could we have another round of appreciation for our panelists? Thank you so much to all of you. It seems to me that two common threads that we might take up between these different interventions on the question of intellectual thought in Mkandawire's legacy. One seems to be related to the interplay between the grounded specificity of the local context in Malawi that informed his approach to political economy, and then the wider transnational and global conversations that he drew on and to which his ideas contributed and intervened, and the logics that his work sometimes burst. The second related thread seems to be the role of the African intellectual, the thinker, her or himself, both in terms of Thandika's own example as an intellectual, and also the theoretical intellectual as invoked in his writings. So we have, on the one hand, Dr. Mori's paper, a reflection on Mkandawire's reformulation of many of Gunnar Myrdal's ideas around nation building in the creation of the democratic developmental state and the role of social policy and economic development, that at the same time rejected the racist, and that's my word, not yours or Mkandawire's, I think he said pessimistic, but right, the racist assumptions about the capacity of the non-Western citizen to realize their own development, economic or intellectual. In Dr. Mendisu's paper, we have the implicit suggestion that the possibilities for the production of knowledge, and in particular, emancipatory and transformative ideas, are somehow constrained by monolingual education of Africa's future and potential intellectuals. In Dr. Ashara's presentation, tracing Mkandawire's own intellectual development from the Malawian Thandika to the global Thandika, we hear a recurrent thread about the necessity of fostering an African intelligentsia and the transformation of higher educational institutions on the continent. In Dr. Murunga's presentation, we have a critical intervention on Mkandawire's rhetoric, the sort of rhetoric of the intellectual, the delivery of his ideas to publics beyond his academic peers, and not just what he said, right, but how he said it as a critical aspect of his intellectualism, including humor. So what I wanted to start by inviting all of you to think about one, to reflect on one idea, and then I have a few individual comments for each of you, and then we'll open it up. I wanted to invite all of you to reflect on what Thandika Mkandawire's legacy might have to teach us about the conditions that contribute to the emergence of a robust intelligentsia, and the spaces of intellectual production, including but also beyond institutions of higher education. Is the African intellectual only the one who is a product of their own nation's formal education system? Does it necessitate experience and exchange beyond the national borders? Does it require that their ideas be developed and written in a transnational language? Okay, so a few thoughts individually. Dr. Murray, it's hard for me not to hear a contrast in your paper between an economist on the one hand who found himself in a foreign country or in several foreign countries, read and engage deeply with its thinkers, considering its trajectory and allowing those insights to percolate into his understanding and analyses of his own context, incorporating what he agreed with and rejecting what he found inadequate. And on the other hand, an economist who came into a space without engaging the populace or its thinkers and made a prescription about their capacity to follow in the path that he assumed was the way forward. It seems clear to me from your quotations from Myrdal and his research assistants in South Asia that his sort of assumption of superiority blinded him to what he might have learned from his interlocutors in Asia. They possibly passed each other in the hallways, in the lunchroom at the University of Stockholm, but did these two men ever speak to one another? And you might not know the answer to that from their writings, but I sort of suspect that while Mkandawire was more or less obliged by disciplinary precedent to cite and draw authority from the work of respected European economists, Myrdal felt no such responsibility and may not have even known that this brilliant Malawian economist was drawing on and improving on his ideas down the hall. Which leads me, sorry, that's a long introduction to a question. Having offered such a comprehensive assessment of what Thandika took from Gunnar, and given your own familiarity with Gunnar's work, what do you think that the Swedish economist might have had to learn from Thandika? Apart from the obvious truth, right, that a Swede or a German or whoever is in no way more worthy or capable of developing a democratic state than a Malawian. To Binyam, your paper highlights the role of language and education policies in realizing some of Mkandawire's aspirations for the development of African states. It also highlights the existing inequality between languages on the continent in terms of orthographic standardization, teaching materials, published texts, and not to mention the differentials in the numbers of speakers and representation in positions of political power. Just in the Tanzanian context, which is the one which I'm most familiar, of course, Kiswahili and Kiluguru are both local African languages, but we cannot compare them in terms of their numbers of speakers or the availability of published resources. And in many areas, as we know, fluency in a spoken language does not necessarily correspond with literacy in that language, even when the resources exist. So I'm wondering if we make a distinction between the language of instruction used in teaching various subjects and the languages as mandatory or elective subjects themselves within the curriculum, and a kind of further distinction between basic communication skills and cognitive or academic language proficiency, the latter of which is necessary for intellectualizing, right, in a given language. I'm curious if you could sort of describe for us or imagine for us what a linguistically diverse secondary school classroom, for instance, would look like that prioritized African languages in its pedagogical framework. Like, what is your utopian vision for how instruction would look in an ideal multilingual classroom? For Dr. Shah, I wanted to come back to this quip about the corrupting effects of politics on African academics, and how brilliant scholars can become unfathomable idiots in the political space, and wondered if you could elaborate us for a bit more about the relationship that Mkandawire envisioned between academia and politics. What did that relationship, could it look like between political leadership and this envisioned African intelligentsia? And finally, for Dr. Murunga, apart from wanting to invite you to tell us more jokes, I wanted to ask you to comment on the balance in Mkandawire's work between sort of speaking back to the power centers of the field, in what in African literary discourse we refer to writing back to the empire, writing back to the imperial core, versus addressing his ideas to local publics in Malawi and other parts of the continent. Just to come back to one of the ideas you shared about methodology, it's interesting to me to think about Thandika sending his students into communities, as economics is not a field we tend to associate with field research. So, what does that mean about the means by which African intellectuals remain connected to wider publics? And just because I'm a literary person, a couple of you quoted Thandika quoting Wole Soyinka. And I thought of Wole Soyinka's novel, The Interpreters, which really satirizes the alienation between middle-class intellectuals and the wider Nigerian public. So when we think about both how politicians remain connected to publics, but also how do academics, including economists, remain connected to the ground in that way. But thank you again. Okay, so go ahead and take a few comments from the audience, a first round, and then we'll...
Hello, I'm Sergey from the University of Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. My question is for Binyam. So I do personally think that we're losing a good sum of knowledge because the international language like English do not have concepts, ideas, or theories that represent our ways of life or our experiences. But when I say our experiences, as for in Ethiopian case, at least I'm representing more than 80 languages, right? We have more than that, and we have more cultures than this. So which one do you think is more feasible or more realistic for us from introducing the educational system based on 80 or more than 80 different languages, or from introducing concepts or words in the English language? We could be introducing injera for English, in English, for instance, and teaching our students E is for injera, because A being for apple, I don't think it's the problem with the language itself, rather the problem with our educational system, if you understand my question. Because I'm from the group of people that thinks that language is a way for knowledge, but not a knowledge by itself, right? So which one do you think is easier for us? And also, if we are thinking about choosing some prominent language from the continent, or choosing some African language, based on the number of speakers we have, choosing Amharic or Romania in the Ethiopian case, wouldn't it be the same as for using English for students that do not speak those languages? So, and in some cases, it might even eventually lead to conflict if these things are politicized as the imposition of culture, as in the case for Amharic in Ethiopia, with the Amharization concepts that's going on in Ethiopia. And also, I want you to explain that, what do you think of this multilingualism as for the need for the transmission of knowledge and the need for communication with other parts of the world as well? So how do you explain that? Thank you.
I'll take two more.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Faisal Garba. So I have a question for, great panel, really great presentation. So I have a question for Binyam and Godwin. So Binyam, so I'm wondering why this problem persists, right? You've laid out brilliantly, the problem, the stunting that happens with monolingualism. So I'm wondering, why does it persist? And just an invitation to think about what these languages do as mechanisms for social differentiation, as kind of a way of sorting a class project. So I'll give you an example. In parts of Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa, you have creches that cost between $2,000 to $5,000. I mean, a colleague did this study on early childhood education. And primary schools where kids spend a semester in France or Madrid to better their French, okay? So I'm wondering whether this interest in terms of creating a next generation of elites, given the role of these languages, could also play a role. Instead of just seeing it as national or continental problems, if we think about it from a class lens and see what's perpetuating it serves. Just an invitation for comments. And my few questions for Godwin. And I want to quote Binyam in asking the question. Binyam said something really great, that it is not all doom and gloom in terms of education on the continent. I think that is really important, right? Because there's a sense in which this networking that Thandika refers to continues until the present day, where the notion of capacity building, SAPS, of course, decimated the capacity of the African University. But the idea is that these are kind of zones of emptiness, very little happens. So all we have to do is to empower them or give them the capacity to stand on their feet. And here, collaboration and funding, become tools for that. And I know you, and I don't know if Ayub is here, had this initiative through the African Charter on transformative collaboration. So if you can say a little bit, about how some of these initiatives try to change the terms of interaction in terms of collaboration. And the final point is around, this point that you made in terms of, or was it Dr. Shara telling the truth, holding power accountable, the role of the social obligation of the intellectual. And I'm wondering, given that we are in the last panel and we're thinking of what is to be done, how is Codestria trying to ensure a generational reproduction of these ideas, especially in light of what you said, that intellectual communities are communities of debate. They are not conforming communities, right? And if we locate Thandika within the milieu that produced him, you can read his debate with Kwesi Pra, for example. There was that General Assembly where Mamdani was celebrated and Thandika was speaking about this vigorous debate that nearly ended in fisticuffs between him and Mamdani about the title of the book that became Citizen Subject, but they went out for coffee to say that how do we sustain this kind of vigorous engagement across the generation, and where dissent is seen as the fulcrum of ideas and not heresy. Thank you.
One more. And then we'll do another round, but we have to give our panelists a chance to respond.
Should I
go? Thank you. So, sorry?
Should I go? Thank you all for such an insightful presentation. My name is Afumia Yalo, coming from Addis Ababa University, Ethiopia. My question is for Professor Binyam as well, and it pertains to the relationship between the language and education dilemma with human capital development in Africa. Could you elaborate on how the education system in Africa could strategically leverage the continent's rich linguistic diversity to improve educational outcomes, promote social cohesion, and empower local communities? Specifically, how can the education curricula be designed to strike a balance between preserving and also promoting indigenous language while simultaneously equipping students with the knowledge and skills that are needed in the global competitive workforce? Additionally, what role can indigenous language play in nurturing a well-rounded, culturally aware human capital that is both deeply connected to local traditions and skilled at navigating demands of the global market as well? Thank you.
Okay, let's start with those for now, and then we'll see if we have time for another round of questions. Binyam, do you want to start, and we can work our way down the panel?
So thank you very much for all your questions. Great questions, by the way. And I think these are, a lot of things have been raised, and these are on their own probably topics of discussion for a full day or a two-day conference. So I don't want to assume that I will have responses to all your questions. It's an ongoing debate, and we need to think and debate about them. So whatever few points I will highlight, I want you to look at it in that light. I think Meg have raised the question about Thandika's contribution, because I know my colleagues will comment on it, so I won't say much. But rather some of my observations in terms of the language question. So the reason why there are a lot of factors. One is this is a long-term business. It's a long-term business, and it requires a multi-layered response. So if you see examples, I think this relates to all the questions Faisal has also raised, but also Ethiopia is one of those countries that was bold enough. We have about 90 languages. Now almost about 50 of them in one way or another are in the school system. So the journey started about 30-something years ago. So the policy was there, all languages were labeled to be equal, and then some attempts were made to support them. So, and the same thing in maybe another good example is also South Africa. After apartheid, South Africa said all 11 languages are official languages, and the policy, at a level of policy, the policy allows support and pave the way for all languages to be used in school. So that is just one part of the puzzle. But the other thing is it needs to be followed up with a commitment in terms of resources, in terms of preparing for it. Preparing for it, as Meg, you have mentioned about textbooks, teachers, schools. I mean, it's just massive work needs to be done. So when I mentioned earlier, multilingualism is important and they need to be reflected in school. But the question is, that's why I made it a question of understanding. If we understand how much investment it requires, you seriously think about it before you make any move. So what has happened both in the case of South Africa and Ethiopia is the policy was there, and some attempts, serious attempts, in all good faith, serious attempts were made, but the result is not as we wanted it, because that lack of commitment, because this is a long-term business, and then it requires all kinds of support and all kinds of preparations. One example from Ethiopia is the agency of developing these languages is given to the local community. Whichever community, if they want to use their language in a school system, they are allowed to do it. So it's one thing as a right, it's important, but at the same time, it requires a consistent support. It requires a system in which we make sure that quality is kept, teachers are ready, schools are ready, textbooks are ready, reading materials are available. So without preparing all of those, just giving it as a right has costed us a lot. And then now we're talking about a crisis in quality of education. Even some, they are saying it's a matter of collapse. So just to say that I still believe it is very important to embrace multilingualism, because that's also what we have outside. It's omnipresent outside. It's in our life. It's in our way of operating. It's in our practice. It has to be there in school if we want school to be meaningful and empowering. But we just have to think. We just have to invest a lot in terms of making it happen in a way that is useful to the children, but also overall to the community. So this is my, the strategy needs to be worked out. And I think this is we will continue to discuss it. That's what I can say.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will take a stab at maybe 2 to 3 questions. And somebody needs to tell Faisal that it's a Saturday afternoon. Difficult questions are not allowed on Saturday afternoon. To the point about talking back to empire, but also connecting these discourses to the public. One of the things that is interesting about Thandika's work at Codesria in particular, but also beyond, even at UNRIST, was that there was always implied in his engagements a basic assumption about what intellectuals ought to do and what the university ought to do. And he writes somewhere, I can't remember where, that there was a point in time when the universities in Africa were in deep crisis. And most Western funding partners who are engaged in this story began to prefer to talk to think tanks like Codesria, rather than to see that we sustain our universities as the basis around which knowledge was produced. And in Codesria, there has developed a tradition that started long time ago, in which our basic defense is investment in basic research. So that debate between basic research on the one hand and applied research on the other hand is one in which we have been extremely reluctant to engage. And part of the reason we've been extremely reluctant to engage is because at the end of the day, what has come to be known as applied research has essentially been what he wrote about the consultancy culture. Normally, I think I've heard too many times some of the colleagues in Codesria make this quote of a former World Bank president who said in one of his speeches that at some point in the 1980s, 1990s, there were more external experts about Africa advising everyone left, right, and center than there ever were colonial officials across the continent. So that's a big statement on our own capacities to engage the communities, to engage governments and all that. And it struck me in, I believe it was 2019, that when I did an assessment of Codesria's contribution to policy, at the moment when we were asked to account for our policy impact, we scored so badly than the moment when we allowed research to define an agenda, develop good research outputs, which policy actors would be interested in. So our impact was higher when nobody asked us about impact than when somebody asked us about impact. And for me, this was not by accident, it was by design. And the argument was that if you invest very well in basic research and you produce good research results, based on good questions, then the chances are that you are talking back to society in a more organic way, if you will, than if you are asked to produce impact. Because what normally some of us do when we are asked to show impact is to tick the box, which then begins to influence how we frame the questions we want to study. And this, therefore, brings me to the question that Faisal asked, which I think is very important. One of Thandika's preoccupation was taking the two front page, cover page of The Economist, the one on the hopeless continent and then Africa rising. And he would use that to map out an understanding of just how much a lot of the very publicized ways of thinking about the continent sort of zeroed in on the faddish, rather than on the substantive content of our work. And there is no doubt in my mind that African universities have gone through perhaps one of the harshest periods any university should go through. That's not in doubt. But this is what's interesting, that at every point in this crisis, across the continent, you will find a level of resilience and a level of creativity and a level of innovation that if put together in groups to do work, they constitute epistemic communities that are just waiting to be advanced as the next generation of African scholarship. And what I think we haven't done so well is to do that process of accumulating this knowledge as part of the package that we are taking over from the previous generation to the next generation. And part of the dilemma here is that African governments don't fund research. I mean, when you listen to presidents of many countries, they are very cynical about knowledge in the first instance. They don't bother about research in the next instance. And as Thandika would tell you, they would rather take a student you taught at LSE as an expert rather than you. You know, Ethiopia was an exceptional case, and some of the presidents were exceptional cases. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the fact that there is a generation of research being produced that is ready to address the situation, what appears like a situation of gloom, the generation of researchers are there. I think we have just failed in terms of picking them and transforming them. And what Thandika did so well in Codesria was to begin to imagine how you do that. So he designed programs that were designed to begin to aggregate these communities of scholarship into a Pan-African context. And he fought actually, same as Adebayo Olukoshi. They fought so very big battles to aggregate what they thought were fragmented communities, atomized in different corners, behaving like they didn't know each other. And there has been a level of success in developing horizontal networking in Africa that just needs to be advanced beyond the point where we are. So the hope is there. I think it's just a question of how do we move a notch higher in terms of creating this community to respond to the questions that are there. As I leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much. So the question to me was, how did Thandika envision the relationship between the state and the intelligentsia? It's a very good question, and I think that the best place to read this is the book, the book that, yes, that Mwalimu Murunga is holding up here. The introduction chapter in that book is by Thandika, and the book is edited by Thandika himself. And there are a few quotes that I took from that chapter. He said he concurred with Mamdani that there is no renaissance without an intelligentsia to drive it. And he said, so he was talking about, this was written when there was talk about the African Renaissance, NEPAD and all of that. And he said what Africa needed was an Africa-focused intelligentsia. He went on to say what was needed was a major rethink by both the political actors and the intelligentsia on the relationship between them. And finally, he said we needed to, we had a responsibility as intellectuals toward this democratic, developmental, and socially inclusive state. So, and I think he lived his life fulfilling these very actions. I gave the example of how he did this workshop in Malawi with the University of Malawi, with Malawian academics. And I think this happened all over the continent from what Codesria has been doing over the decades. So let me mention this report that came out in 2019 by the Africa Capacity Building Foundation, ACBF. It's in Harare. It's a specialized agency of the African Union Commission. It is responsible for capacity building. It released a report in 2019 on what Africa needs in terms of capacities for achieving the SDGs as well as achieving the Agenda 2063. And it said it's really a matter of capacity. And this theme was recurring in Thandika's work, capacity, because he was quite emphatic in what the SABs had done in eroding capacity at the state level, but also in the higher education institutions. And he felt it was really imperative to bring back this capacity. And so I think this, I've never heard anybody cite this report from the SB. I think it's necessary. We need this report because the investors need to look at that report and decide what capacities are needed and build courses around those capacities. We've got institutions like AFIDEP. I once worked at AFIDEP, the African Institute for Development Policy. Their main work is bridging research, the gap between research and policy and implementation. And they argue that this is what academics lack. In fact, when I was at AFIDEP, this is one of my projects. I worked on a project where we went around, we had funding from the Hewlett Foundation, but we brought together academics from West Africa and East Africa because that's where the region that they were working in, and training them on evidence-informed policymaking. How do you convert research into policy and then into implementation? And there was this really powerful article I read one day that said, when an African minister sits on his or her desk every morning, what do they read first? Is it an academic journal? It's the newspaper. And so there are multiple ways of converting research into a format that policymakers can understand. And I think it's, right now, AFIDEP is in Malawi, they're working with universities to try and build this capacity. So I don't know the extent to which they work with Codesria, but I think it's really important. And that is the kind of relationship that Thandika envisaged between the state and intellectuals. Thank you.
Okay, so my question was, what would Gunnar Myrdal learn from Thandika Mkandawire? I have zero faith in Gunnar Myrdal. So I imagine that if he was walking through the hallway, he wouldn't. But why do I say that? In An American Dilemma, the US book, he did not bring the voices out of his subjects, for example. He was studying Black Americans, and it's invisible. His main audience remains white Americans, white liberal Americans specifically in the North. Even more deeply, he repeated in the manuscript, in the book, that he saw zero value in Black culture, and that it was in the interest of Black Americans to assimilate into all norms, all cultural, social, economic norms of white Americans. So there we go. And then in Asian drama, as I already read the critique, there was no mention of the voices of his subjects. But what can we learn? Because I don't actually write with Gunnar in mind. I write with basically me and younger versions of us across the global majority. And some of these texts are part of the hegemony. So we're going to question hegemony in knowledge production. What, in my opinion, what better way but to grab at the texts that are so coveted, that are so central to that power structure? And so that's what attracted me to An American Dilemma, and Asian drama is yet another one. So I would do a call for all of us and younger generations of students to question those texts, those absolutely boring 3-volume texts, and sit there and find interlocutors. Paul mentioned this early on the first day, which is putting people in dialogue with each other. So it's very helpful. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Thandika Mkandawire shows flaws in this hegemonic version of developmental theory, and expose. But if one is going to expose those loopholes, those inequities, those prejudices in theories of change and theory that have impact on practice, we need institutions like, here I'm doing the pitch for the Africa Institute, for Codesria, for the Miami Institute, for Transcontinental. We need institutes to nurture that space and to be well-funded. And I say this because the networks of people behind those very texts that are central to the power structure in knowledge production are absolutely well-funded, continuously funded, and someone such as Gunnar Myrdal, as an example, had unlimited funding from Carnegie Corporation when he did An American Dilemma. In the midst of the Great Depression, unlimited access to any scholar that he wanted to enlist across the United States. Right? 8 years of funding, and he wrote to his friends from the top floor of the Chrysler Building and said, I feel like I'm on top of the world. And then when he did Asian drama, he extended his funding from 20th Century Fund. It was supposed to be just a few years. 10 years, who gets that? So there is quite a bit of rule breaking, of funding norms, and great support, armies of funding, armies of institutional power across universities funding those texts. So read them, get those interlocutors, publish those gaps, expose it, but then also have the institutional support so you can continue your work.
I think we have time for one. No. I wanted to at least let Emery give his question, since the mic was literally yanked from his mouth while he was about to ask it. Okay, so you'll ask the question, but they'll answer you during the tea break. How's that? We want to hear the question.
So, Binyam, so I had a question for you. I mean, I agree with you that, you know, we have to aim for multilingualism. But I wanted to get back to the question of literacy decline. So what we see now, it seems like it's a global phenomenon. So in places like Bulgaria, Finland, France, there are also, you know, this problem of, I mean, the kids can't just read. So how would you explain that? You know, yet in these countries they speak, I mean, the language of instruction is, let's say, French, where everyone speaks French, and, you know, Bulgarian, and, you know, in Finland, it's also their own language. So the question that Meg asked, and I think Prof. Murunga answered very well, that we don't fund our research. I think the logic here is that you know, in political economy, we don't transform our raw materials, so we export them. So the same logics, you know, apply to when it comes to our students. We just train them to a certain degree, and we export them. They you know, valued added, and then they come back to us. So I think these are the 2 points.
So your assignment during the tea break is to discuss Emery's questions, all of you. Thank you all so much. Thank you to our panelists.